Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry podcast. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. I'm Robert Bryce, and today, welcoming back for the second appearance on the Power Hungry podcast, my friend Steve Brick, who last appeared on the podcast in February of 2021 after the Texas blackouts. Steve, welcome back to the Power Hungry podcast.
Thank you, Robert. I'm really happy to be back. I enjoy listening to it, and I'm honored to be asked back a second time.
Well, okay. Really pleased to have you. We took too long a time in between. But first, before I'm going to have you introduce yourself. But before you do, I'm throwing a curveball at you. What is on your shirt there? You showed me what is on your shirt. I thought about making this the last question. I'm going to make it first question. What is on your shirt there?
All right. You want me to tilt my camera?
Yeah, you're gonna have to show us with the tilt
All
the
right.
camera there.
So here we go. This is a picture of my hero, Ready Kilowatt. Ready Kilowatt, as you know, Robert, was the mascot of the investor-owned utilities in the United States of America from the 1930s, really consistently on up through the 1970s. And some of us grew up with Ready. They used Ready as a representative of the utility, as a way to kind of sell utility products. I have a large collection of Ready Kilowatt memorabilia. I call it my archives. My wife calls it my junk. When are you going to get rid of that junk? But as many companies did at the time, they had all kinds of swags that they gave away to their customers, all of which featured Ready Kilowatt, and much of this swag sort of appealed to the mores and behaviors of the time. So I've got a large collection of cards that feature Ready Kilowatt in various different poses and things of that sort. They gave away bridge pads for people who played bridge, because bridge used to be super popular.
Right, and you gave me a coffee mug with Ready on it. You gave me a belt buckle with Ready on it, and I just looked it up. I remember a friend of mine from Southern Company. It was originally designed in 1926, made the first published appearance in 1926, brainchild of Alabama Power executive named Ash Collins, and
Yeah.
it was featured part of the and as you know, you were in our film Juice. Ready Kilowatt is in Juice as well, dancing around the kitchen. I wash and dry your clothes, play your radios. You can sing along with us.
And there's a shot of the coffee mug that I gave you in Juice also.
That's right. It was a product placement, as they say in the business there, Steve.
Yeah.
So now we've talked about Ready and we've introduced Ready. You have not introduced yourself. Please, guests on this podcast introduce themselves. Steve, if you don't mind, imagine you've arrived somewhere. You have 60 seconds. Introduce yourself, please.
Well, Robert, I've logged more than 40 years in this particular business, and I what I would say is I've worked on all sides of the electricity business. I started out my career working at the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, which was the agency that was responsible, or still is responsible, for regulating utilities. I moved from there into a consulting role and did a wide variety of projects relating to utility planning and utility regulation for a wide range of clients. I worked for a subsidiary of Pacific Gas and Electric for a number of years doing power plant and associated infrastructure development. I headed up the arm of a research organization here again in Wisconsin that was a partnership between the utilities to try to kind of centralize some of the research related to questions that were of interest to them. But I've kind of come at it from every side, and I would say that 40 years has brought me to the conclusion that there is no commodity, there is no product that is more central to modern life than electricity. And I think I certainly didn't start in the business with that appreciation, but I firmly believe that now. And there's almost nothing you can think of associated with not just the luxuries, but the necessities of day-to-day life that doesn't somehow involve electricity. And that electricity needs both to be reliable and cost-effective.
Well, okay, good introduction. And we agreed that I would refer to you independent power systems consultant is how you prefer to be identified. You have several other affiliations with nonprofit groups. Well, let's talk about that, because when you said that about this idea of electricity and what it is, And I just met with a friend of mine here in Austin, Jackie Sargent, who was head of Austin Energy. It's a question I put to other people on this podcast. So, is electricity a commodity or is it a service?
Well, I guess I would say the answer is both.
Aha.
I think it's principally a service. It's
But it's
it
sold as a commodity.
well, it's sold as a commodity and has in many respects always been sold as a commodity, but for most of its life, it was treated as a natural monopoly, and the holders of those monopolies were held responsible in most cases by the regulatory agencies that regulated them by meeting standards of reliability and by ensuring that the product that they produced was as cost effective as possible. And so in a sense, under that model, it did not represent a commodity because the price was controlled by the forces of regulation. And that, commodities aren't that way. Commodities are driven by market prices.
And regulated, I'm sorry to interrupt, but regulated by the Public Service Commission,
By the
right?
Public Service Commission.
And I'll just, we talked about this, I know before, but the thing that made me think about more of its service, or the idea, was a guy from named Mark Gabriel. I heard it from him in the Western Area Power Administration. He said, look, supplying an extra watt hour doesn't make a big difference to us. We just have to make sure we provide this all the time. So he was the first to characterize it as a service. And then I saw that in Beirut myself, where the generator mafia, they don't put any meters on your home. They ask how many amps you want. So they sell it as a service, right? As a flow of energy. And so, but I like your idea that it's both, or is treated as both.
Yeah, yeah, and again, why do we regulate natural monopolies? And I think that the case for regulation historically has always been made that these are markets that are not going to be served well by purely competitive models, and critically, they deliver a product that is essential. So water, for example, is an example. Water is typically regulated. You don't have competing water utilities in the
Right.
same area, and the rates for those for the water that you consume is set by regulation. And electric utilities, again, for the vast bulk of the period that we've been using it, was regulated. And in fact, one of the reasons that here's a fun fact to know and tell. One of the reasons we have regulation is because Samuel Insull, another one of my heroes, was set off from the Edison Company to establish utility in Chicago. And he was going and picking off customers in ones and twos, and they tended to be wealthy customers. And all of a sudden, a light went on in Insull's head, and he said, wait a minute. In order to provide the most cost-effective electricity, I need to get more customers so I can make better use of my equipment, and that will drive costs down for everybody. At the same time he recognized that, he said, oh, and by the way, this only works as a monopoly, so I have got to enter into a compact with the state to turn this into a regulated utility. So it wasn't something that was actually imposed externally, but this came from the industry itself, from the mind of Samuel Insull.
And I'm glad, I know we've talked about Insull as well, both online, I think, and offline, but it just that, he is vilified in many cases. Many biographies have vilified him, but he was really tremendous, tremendously inventive, tremendously innovative, and was always seeking that economies of scale, and he achieved them and drove down the price of electricity dramatically. For his customers over the period of decades that he was in Chicago. And then, of course, he died penniless, was found, I guess, with no money in his pocket in a Paris subway, if I'm remembering correctly.
I would say, again, he was in some senses a victim of circumstance, and took the rap for greater economic forces that were going on around him. And so I think of Insull as being unfairly vilified in many ways. And you're right, there's a kind of a cartoon version of Insull in which he was kind of the utility version of the robber baron.
Right.
But I think there are a couple of deeper studies of him that paint a much fairer picture. And I certainly started my career having this picture of Insull being in the villain camp. But then after I read particularly the MacDonald biography of Insull, I went, yeah, actually he's pretty important character, and he doesn't always get a fair rap.
Right. He was named out. He was singled out by name by FDR when Roosevelt was running for president in 1931. I mean, he was one of the people who FDR vilified as being the evils of the public utility holding companies. But so let's talk. Let's move to talk more broadly about grids. And I know you've been working a lot in Africa, and I want to talk about Africa as well. Or maybe why don't we just start there and tell us about what the work you're doing in Africa is, because I've been looking at numbers on electricity availability in Africa, and this is in a continent now of 1.4 billion people, who, in total, these are in very round numbers, general numbers, use about the same amount of electricity as 35 million Canadians. I mean, there's just an enormous, gaping need for more electricity in Africa. Let me ask a simple question: why doesn't Africa have more electricity? What is holding back electrification in Africa?
Well, that's an important question with a complicated answer. Africa is being held back in more ways than just electricity, and in much of sub-Saharan Africa suffers from chronic underdevelopment. Per capita income is among the lowest in the world in many sub-Saharan African countries. And things like electricity have a tendency to follow low economic development. When you start asking yourself the question of why is the development situation what it is in sub-Saharan Africa, in most places in sub-Saharan Africa, it is not entirely an indigenous problem. And as you know, in the late 19th century, the dash for Africa, the largely European dash for colonization in Africa, really set the stage for many of the problems that sub-Saharan Africa continues to contend with today. So Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, all had their colonies in Africa. They were colonies that were established primarily for extractive purposes. European nations saw the wealth of natural resources and effectively came in and colonized to, in part, extract those things. And then as we transitioned away from those colonial relationships, the systems that were put in place to try to assist the development of sub-Saharan African nations did not entirely succeed. But we got to a place where, in a way, the development fates of those nations are really in the hands of organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And so I think that has been a critical roadblock for full economic development in Africa, in the sense that African nations, I think, first have to figure out what it is that organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund want, and then they have to conform their expectations to those external funders, as opposed to any kind of process of figuring out what it is Africans need and what it is Africans want. Electricity is a subset of that problem. And one of the reasons why I'm back involved working in sub-Saharan Africa, I started my career when I got out of graduate school. Before I actually worked for the Public Service Commission, I spent a couple of years working on a variety of projects funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development in North Africa and West Africa. And this was in the 1980s. And I got there, and it didn't take me very long to realize that the work that we were sent there to do wasn't fit to purpose. I was over there peddling something that these nations didn't need. What I was peddling was something that was trendy in the United States and trendy in Europe. And so it was naturally assumed that what was trendy there would be useful in Africa, but in fact, it wasn't useful. And at that time, the first job I was sent over there to do was to develop a more kind of advanced forecasting model for the utilities, whereas these utilities had very little basic demand, and they didn't have any real need for a sophisticated forecasting model.
So if I can interrupt, because what I'm trying to get to is, and you mentioned this before about the colonial history, and it seems to me the one that I puzzle over in my head. Well, which comes first? Is the electricity or the wealth? But you need a certain amount of wealth to stimulate the electricity, right? I'm just trying to jump a little bit ahead here in terms of, well, okay, well, how do you stimulate demand? And it's something we've talked about before, but here are the numbers: 640 terawatt hours of generation in Canada in 2021, a little less than 900 in Africa that same year. When you have this vast disparity in population. So do Africans have to get richer to get electricity, or are we going to have electricity come in from the outside so they get a chance to get richer?
Well, again, that's a chicken and an egg problem, and I don't think it's quite that simple.
Okay.
Africans need to get richer. And one of the questions that I often find myself posing to people is, well, if this is the average GDP in the OECD, in the developed part of the world, why shouldn't every African aspire roughly to the same level of GDP?
Right.
Why shouldn't we work to bring African living standards and African wealth standards up to at least OECD averages? But again, the problem with the chicken and the egg, which creates what? Electricity is definitely a precondition for developing the industry and the commerce needed by modern society. And so one of the challenges that Africa faces is in many sub-Saharan countries, the grid is not reliable and the power is expensive. And that proves to be an impediment to further economic development, industrial and commercial, which is going to drive the jobs, which is going to produce the wealth for Africans. So in that sense, it is a precondition. It's a prerequisite. But the flip side is, you look at projects in Africa designed to increase access to electricity in certain places, and if people are so poor that they can't afford devices that consume electricity, then they're not all that interested in having large, modern levels of electricity access.
Right.
So people need to be wealthy so they can consume electricity, but you need electricity to drive the development of the economy.
Right. So it's that they go hand in hand, right? Electricity drives economic growth, and economic growth drives electricity. But then what is? I know there were some recent articles that were published, I think in Energy for Growth Hub elsewhere, about this solar project in Zambia that had World Bank funding, I think, and it was kind of viewed as a failure. I don't want to pick on that necessarily, but maybe I'll ask it this way then: what's the recipe for success in bringing more electricity to Africa? What projects have proven successful, and where?
Yeah, well, the success is make sure you're focusing on, make sure you clearly understand what Africans want, and make sure you focus on outcomes that will produce that. So I said earlier, and probably not clearly enough, in the 1980s, I realized that we were peddling something Africans didn't need. And I got back involved when I did 7 or 8 years ago, because I started looking at what USAID and what the World Bank and others were promoting in Africa. And I went, wait a minute, we're selling something that's trendy in the United States, that's trendy in Europe, but in my opinion, it was of questionable value in Africa. So I'll be very specific. There was a very heavy emphasis on solar and wind. There was a very heavy emphasis on mini grids, on little isolated grids to serve isolated communities. All of those things are very trendy in America and very trendy in Europe, but I was quite skeptical that they were the most reasonable way to kind of meet African needs. And so let me give you an example. Um, the world's largest, or one of the world's largest concentrating solar thermal projects is in Morocco. And that project was successfully built and financed, mostly financing coming from World Bank and International Monetary Fund kind of organizations. It's a massive project, over $1 billion US investment. And it suffers from a lot of the same sort of attributes that other solar projects do. It's intermittent. It doesn't provide reliable around the clock power, and it's expensive. It's a very expensive source of generation. And I realized one of the things that I looked at was, what could they have invested in for the same amount of money, and how much more electricity could it have provided for Moroccan citizens? And at that point, the cheapest form of generation would have been natural gas combined cycle power plant, and they could have provided something like 5 times the amount of power, and it would have been reliable on demand power. Now, of course, the downside is that's got you have emissions associated with that natural gas power, but from the standpoint of providing electricity access, a clearly much more expensive option was effectively put on Morocco, where there were other things that would have provided a lot more power to a lot more people a lot more cheaply. And that's
So it was a climate focus rather than a people focus in that case, and that was resulted in fewer people getting electricity.
Yeah, and again, in a lot of places, one of the challenges with the entire kind of electricity development paradigm in Africa is that it's driven by a bunch of misconceptions, and that's in part why I'm involved trying to kind of right some of those misconceptions. So, just in no particular order, it's widely conceived as a residential problem. That is, you see pictures, people want to talk about energy access, and you're shown a village in Africa someplace, and a dwelling that has suddenly been illuminated by a single light bulb or by a couple of light bulbs. It's not principally a residential problem, although it is a residential problem, but it's a commercial and it's an industrial problem. And those kinds of small incremental changes, which in fact I don't want to gainsay the importance of having a lighting where you didn't have any lighting before, but they're not going to systematically fix the problem. It's also portrayed as a rural problem, that inadequate access to electricity is something that's only experienced in rural parts of the continent, and that's not the case. It's a problem that is experienced both in urban areas and in rural areas, and it's, as I said, it's experienced across all segments of the economy. The third and most important one is it's often conceived of purely as a problem of supply. So the model is, all we have to do is go in and build some more power plants. Well, in fact, if we look across sub-Saharan Africa, we find oftentimes that there's actually surplus capacity. And what we need to do is we need to find ways to stimulate demand and take advantage of that insight that Samuel Insull had more than a century ago, to spread those costs over more consumers and drive the unit cost down.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because there was just a news clip about you mentioned excess power. A German company going to Angola and now planning to produce hydrogen from hydropower in Angola because there's not enough electricity consumption from the hydropower. So the idea then that they will make hydrogen from that, turn it into ammonia, ship it to Germany, turn it back into hydrogen. I'm thinking this is the worst kind of Rube Goldberg device ever imagined, but nevertheless, it speaks to this issue of that you're saying here, is that here's Angola with excess power that's not being consumed, and locals are saying, well, we should keep that power here, but there's no mechanism for them to be electrified, or even if they could be electrified, that they would have enough money to buy the power. So what I hear you saying, what I'm reading back to you, is that you have to have the load and the generation have to match if you're going to make a successful project, and
Yeah.
that load has to come industrial, commercial, and residential. If it's or one of those is going to have to be involved, or it doesn't matter necessarily where the load goes, as long as you have somewhere to that is going to absorb all that power. Otherwise, you're wasting money. Is that a
Yeah.
fair read back?
Oh yeah, yeah, and again, the Angolan project that you talk about is just a single example of which I can cite several others, and that's just really a kind of a continuation of the old colonial model, right? You've got something we want, and we'd like to find a deal where we can get it, right? And in this case, it's surplus power, or there's a massive renewable analog to the Angola thing proposed for Namibia, where again the proposal is to build out a massive amount of wind to produce hydrogen in Namibia for export to Europe.
So
And
it's a
again,
different kind of colonialism, although now it's about climate colonialism or green colonialism, as some people have put it, but that it's still exporting this thing produced in the colony to then go back to Europe for whatever reason, right? For
so yeah, so the question that doesn't really get asked or doesn't get adequately addressed is, so how does that help Africans?
right.
You can see how it might help Germans, but it isn't obvious to me how it would help Africans, or whether it's the thing that Africans would focus on, were the question left to them.
Right.
Um,
So, what about natural gas then in Africa? There have been massive discoveries there offshore, Tanzania, Mozambique. Memory serves several other countries. The gas fields are starting to be developed. How important is gas going to be as a fuel for the future of electrification in Africa?
well, I think you're right. There's massive offshore resources in the Indian Ocean off Mozambique. Uh, Discoveries on the Atlantic side, off of Mauritania, off of Morocco. Ghana has got gas. Obviously, Nigeria's got gas. And there's a very spirited debate on the future role of natural gas in Africa. Um, my view is that is a question that Africans must determine the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
That is, and there are a lot of non-Africans weighing in very powerfully on that question, and candidly, most of them on the side of Africa must not develop its gas resources, and I personally feel that is a matter of self-determination for Africa and for Africans, and that is where that decision has to be made. And I suspect, there. I think that developing those resources takes money, but I think assuming the resources can be developed, uh, all of the things being equal, I would imagine to see gas play a fairly major role as Africa continues to climb up, as sub-Saharan African nations continue to climb up the economic development ladder. But again, it's a very spirited debate, and there are people who would probably take issue with my claim that it ought to be a matter of self-determination for African nations.
Right. But isn't I saw one headline, I need to follow up on it, but it was the I think Tanawe project. I think it is in Mozambique, that they're going to use gas from the ExxonMobil offshore field, and there was several hundred megawatts of new generation that were being developed there. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not entirely up to speed on that, and that the Mozambique development had gone along quite a ways, and then it kind of hit it kind of they kind of put the pause on it.
Uh-huh.
Because again, this was before the war in Ukraine, so we were in a place where the world was kind of awash in natural gas, and kind of awash in cheap natural gas. And I'm not 100% up to speed on what has been proposed recently by way of new generation. Um, I mean, one of the things, Robert, that you also bring to mind in the wake of the Ukraine war, there was a deal announced last winter where European nations and America agreed to put some investment into renewables in Egypt, so Egypt could retire some of its natural gas plants, so it could sell natural gas to Europe.
Uh-huh. Right.
And once again, when that was announced, and I was scratching my head, going, "Wait a minute!" And this is good for Egypt? How?
Right.
So
Here it is. I found it's the Tamani project. It's 450 megawatts. And there's a transmission project that goes along with it. But it's, it's a big deal, $650 million, something like that. And for the power plant, and then for the other infrastructure. But it's a partnership between Electricidad de Mozambique, Sasol, Africa, and Global Ec. That project got financed in late 2021. But that was an example, one of the few that I know of, and I'm not an expert on Africa, you are, but that here's an example of a big project that looks like the opposite of kind of what you were talking about before this whole smallest beautiful microgrids. No, we need a big central power plant, and we're going to build a lot, we're going to build it out, and we're going to use local fuel and make this work. And the fact that it's natural gas, not coal, I think is interesting as well, and maybe makes it more financeable then, because coal plants now, Africa, around the world, I want to broaden this out and talk about electricity development around the world. Is it possible or my understanding is World Bank has just quit financing all coal-fired power plants anywhere in the world. Is that true?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that coal-fired power plants aren't being built. I mean, as you know, China has built a huge number of coal-fired power plants, and some are still under construction. But it's harder and harder to finance a coal-fired power plant, and gas plants are going to be easier in general to finance. And again, you look around Africa. Ghana has a number of 500, in the range of 500 megawatt power plants. You'll find gas power plants scattered around the continent. And again, one of the other myths that is perpetrated, it's connected to the microgrid myth, is that Africa's development path, sub-Saharan Africa's development path, doesn't have to go the same as Europe and America's did. We don't need a grid. We're going to leapfrog the grid. That's the term that gets used all the time. And we're going to just have distributed power. But in fact, we look at these countries, and the vast majority of the population lives within close proximity to the grid. These are sub-Saharan countries. Ghana, Kenya are rapidly urbanizing.
Right.
People are moving from the rural areas, want to relocate from rural areas to urban areas, and all those urban areas are gridded.
Right.
And so that idea that somehow or other it's going to be this network of unconnected little bitty microgrids is not very real. And
it's not as efficient capital wise, right? I mean, is it still true? I mean, that we talked about Insull and Edison before.
Yeah.
The rule of thumb has always been the bigger the grid, generally speaking, the more and the bigger your power plant, the more efficient the overall operation is. Is that still the case?
Yeah. If you want to make a very little amount of electricity very expensively, build a microgrid.
Or put it another way, you want to make expensive power, make a small grid. That be another?
I mean, and again, I did an analysis 3 or 4 years ago of a bunch of the microgrid projects that were funded in West Africa, and they all penciled out at 50 to 75 cents per kilowatt hour. We're talking US right now. On any given day, we're talking 3 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour.
Residential rates. I just looked at residential rates in the U.S. The latest number is like 13.5, right?
Well, but remember, I'm just talking generation costs.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. Fair enough.
And again, that's cost, not price necessarily. And
okay.
So
gotcha.
We often have a disconnect. At any rate, I kind of systematically found that they were very expensive. They were subsidized. Somebody else was paying the bill for the most part, by way of, I think, wanting to try to launch the market for microgrids or whatever. But as an economic proposition, they didn't look particularly good.
Yeah, well, but let's talk about that because one of the other things that fascinates me, and it's something that you and I have talked about on other occasions, is the issue of corruption. And it's something I've seen myself. And Nigeria, of course, has been an example of this. And I could pick other countries as well, but Iraq is another example where you have a long-term society that has had generational corruption, and Nigeria is one of the best examples. Billions spent on trying to upgrade the grid with effectively no progress. So, let me counter to what you just said. Yes, grids as they shrink, the power may get more expensive, but doesn't making a smaller grid make them less vulnerable to the societal corruption that's derailed larger grids from being successful?
Yeah, I think corruption finds its way through the cracks from the highest to the lowest end of the system. I don't think the size of the grid
Mm,
necessarily says anything about whether it's going to be subject to corruption or not. Um, uh, I will say that you know the kind of model of a federally controlled utility, a federally controlled energy ministry, and not very robust local controls, in a sense, seems more susceptible to me than if you had a bunch of smaller regional utilities that were serving at the state level, as opposed to one national. But that wouldn't, if even if you had that, it wouldn't be immune to corruption.
right.
And again, the corruption in Africa is a complicated question. And in a way, I kind of immediately begin by going, well, that's another legacy of colonialism.
Hmm.
And again, we look at places where the utilities are fairly well run, and where there's the corruption is not particularly evident. I would cite Ghana, for example, as a place that um, is an example where I think the utility is relatively well run, and their problems stem from other concerns. So, for example, we've been involved in a study where they were looking at losses on the system in Ghana. And this goes right to a point that you made in the Juice movie, where people were stealing from the system.
Right.
But it turns out that again, the myth is that these are small householders who are somehow stealing from the system. Well, the study that was done in Ghana showed that there were a handful of very large industrial customers that had figured out how to start stealing from the
Right.
system,
Yeah.
and that kind of exploded that myth. So I think those kinds of losses to the system, which of course increase cost to everybody, are probably in most places a larger problem than genuine corruption. I mean, the most explosive corruption story, of course, recent times is South Africa, which is
Right.
which is a tragedy of almost unimaginable proportions, given where Eskom, the South African utility, used to be, in terms of their efficiency and the relative level of electrification that occurred in South Africa. They've taken massive step backwards, and the corruption has been pretty blatant. And they're now living through a period where they're having extended rotating outages almost on a continuing basis.
I've been following the situation in South Africa because I'm writing up a paper about it, about the issue of electrification in the developing world, and I saw that they're now they've chartered Karen D's power ships to provide power into South Africa, which is what We reported obviously in Juice and in my last book, A Question of Power, right? Where the central government is too corrupt to make their power plants work, then they go to power ships because as soon as they quit paying the bills, the power ship goes back to Turkey, and that's what exactly what happened
Right.
in Lebanon. So let's move past the corruption and the Africa discussion, even though I'm sure we could spend a lot of time there. Let me ask a broader question about electric grids, and then I want to focus on the U.S. and what's been happening here lately. What do people misunderstand? What do they not? Or I'll put it this way: why is electricity hard for people to understand, particularly policymakers?
Well, it's hard to understand because it's a system and it's a complicated system. And so you and I have talked about this before, Robert. US basically is divided into three large areas: the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and Texas.
Right.
And each of those geographies is effectively one large interconnected machine. All of the generation, all of the loads, all of the electricity consuming devices are effectively a part of an integrated machine. And the only way you can kind of make sense of it is by looking at it as the system that it is. And that's complicated, and it's not easily reducible to political sound bites.
Yeah.
And it's always been that way, by the way. But I think modern times have made it a much bigger problem. So now, for example, I'll give you an example of a classic failure to consider the system problem. My favorite bugaboo, called the levelized cost of energy, levelized cost of electricity. You and I have talked about this.
Oh, sure.
Before. And it's a simplified way to express the expected cost of a particular generating technology. And so you'll see press accounts now that say, oh, well, the levelized cost of electricity for wind is now cheaper than the levelized cost of electricity for coal, or the levelized cost of electricity for gas. The implication that they want you to draw from that is, oh, well, that means that all we should do is be investing in wind.
Right.
But as I like to say, nobody pays the levelized cost of anything. Nobody makes an investment based on the levelized cost of anything. And all that matters from the consumer standpoint is, what's the system cost?
Right.
And that is not accurately reflected in any way by the levelized cost of electricity. But that simplified metric it's just so irresistible, and
because it's simple, right? Because it's simple, and oh, well, this one is because of this one metric, right? But it doesn't. I guess that's not a good soundbite to say, well, what does it cost? Well, it depends.
Yeah, it depends. That's right. The other reason, Robert, is broadly, one of the things we know, and one of the great luxuries of living in a place like America or Europe, is on most occasions, you walk into your house and you flip a switch and a light goes on.
Right.
We have very high level of reliability. Electricity is cheap for us, relatively speaking, and we don't want to think about it. And there's abundant evidence that public doesn't want to spend its time thinking about power system dynamics. They want the service that electricity provides. And so when does the public pay attention? Well, the public pays attention when things go wrong.
Right.
Public pays attention when prices spike. And
those are relatively occasional events, or they're relatively rare, to your point.
But there are also occasions when politicians and regulators are inclined to make bad decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's the reason sort of traditional regulation worked was because in most places, not in all places, but in most places, the role of the Public Utility Commissioner was mostly depoliticized.
Uh-huh.
And the commissions saw themselves as kind of the arbiter that stood between the utility and its investors who had rights and interests in the grid, and the consumers,
Right.
and who demanded reliability and needed to have power provided cost effectively. But they realized that it was a balancing act, right? The investors were putting the money up, and the investors had a right to expect a return on their investment. And that needed to be balanced with the interest of the consumers. And once you start kind of going down that path, it becomes very difficult to kind of simplify and politicize it. And so, for a long time, regulation worked reasonably well from a kind of a plug and chug way. Investors got their money back, rates were reliable, people were happy for the
Right.
most part. And again, the happier you are, the more invisible the system is going to be. You talk about the generator mafia in Lebanon. Well, that's a place where the system isn't invisible.
Right.
Anybody who lives under those circumstances is keenly aware of what they need to do to try to make sure that they've got power when they want to have power,
And how much it costs them,
and how
right?
much it costs them.
Because for a lot of us, it's a relatively minor expense. Um, but I'll just add one thing, if you don't mind. You talked about the Eastern Interconnect, the Western Interconnect, and Texas. So those are the major interconnects, and then within those are the RTOs, and underneath those are the public utility commissions in each state, and underneath those are the different co-ops, the different investor-owned utilities, publicly owned utilities, and independent power producers. It's just staggeringly complicated. So, is that one of the other reasons why our policymakers are just so bad at talking about it? Is that they don't want to say it's complicated and it's hard to make a soundbite out of it? That figures in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we went through an extensive wave of utility regulatory reform,
Right. Restructuring, as Ken Lay called it.
restructuring. And the idea being at the time that what we should do is we should divide the industry up into its principal component parts: generation side, which is the power plants and other forms
Right.
of supply; high voltage transmission, which is the highways; and local distribution, which gets the power the last few miles to the basic customer. And the argument was theoretically that the only thing that really was a natural monopoly was the transmission and the distribution side, and the generation could be completely deregulated.
Mm-hmm.
And a number of states went sort of completely down that pathway. So California, for example, is a state that the generation is completely deregulated. You, Robert, live in a state where the generation is completely deregulated. Well, I live in Wisconsin.
This is the Enron legacy.
Yeah, I live in Wisconsin, where we started going down that pathway, but then the legislature got cold feet and said, no, we're gonna kind of stick with the tradition. So the other thing that makes it complicated is that we've got this regulatory patchwork out there,
Right.
all the way from traditionally vertically integrated and traditionally regulated to deregulated generation, to transmission being held by completely independent companies. And so again, that takes that already complicated patchwork that you talk about and makes it even more complicated.
Right. You said, and before we started or hit record, that you said you have buyer's regret for promoting deregulation. I'll just add one quick point. When I was researching my first book on Enron now, which is out almost 20 and a half years ago, Pipe Dreams, when I was doing the interviews for that, I talked to a guy named Jim Walzell, who was an executive of Houston Natural Gas. He left when Ken Lay came aboard at Enron. And he told me at that time, now this is 20 years ago, he said, I don't think this electric deregulation is going to be good for consumers. He said, I just don't see how it can be. So I'm back to the question you said yourself a few minutes ago. You have buyer's regret for promoting deregulation. Were you wrong, and why were you wrong?
I was wrong. I think
the integrated model's better.
Well, I was wrong because for the reasons that we're often wrong, right? It's that we start thinking about an alternative. The alternative is being formed by kind of theoretical underpinnings. and we kind of tightly constrain our thinking about the possible outcomes to a narrow range of conditions that are going to come to play, while we ignore um, anything outside of that circle that might make the story sound less good. And so with deregulation, uh, we began by sort of saying, and in part, I will just basically say that in part, I got involved with colleagues in thinking about deregulatory models because although there were examples around the country of states where regulation was continuing to work fairly well, there were also examples where regulation didn't work so well.
Mm-hmm.
Regulators failed to sort of deliver on basic elements of their job. And so the thought was, could we do better with it with a competitive system? We devised in our brains models that in theory should work, but failed to consider the factors that could make those models work less than optimally,
Right.
and really failed to think about what are we giving up? What do we give up for this, subjecting these power plants to market sources? Some of the so for example, on the what did we not consider? Well, we didn't consider that in a lot of places, if you were going to cause companies to divest of resources, they had ways to legally meet the terms of divesting of those sources while still retaining ownership through another vehicle in those same sources.
Uh-huh.
So you had a new name, you had a deregulated company, but the basic ownership interests were more or less unchanged, and so purely competitive forces really didn't come into play. And there's some places in the Northeast where I think are kind of fair examples of that. And then in the spirit of what do we give up, and you and I have talked about this before, and this is the thing that causes me to my deepest regret is the utility commission and the utility were able to focus on the entire system from the generation through the transmission all the way to the distribution system.
In the vertically integrated model, in which the Edison and Insull model, where the one company owns the generation plant, they own all the wires and they own the meter, everything between the boiler and your wall socket.
That's right. And so they had to keep the entire picture in view as they made decisions, and it was frequently imperfect, but they were not able systematically to ignore important parts of the system. Well, now here we are in this patchwork, and you mentioned, for example, regional transmission organizations. Well, they nominally hold responsibility for the high voltage transmission in particular areas, and in some cases, it's a regulatory authority and an operational authority where with the ownership dispersed among utility holders. And they don't bring a kind of a full system perspective to the questions that they address.
Because they're not responsible for reliability.
Well, they're not responsible for reliability in all cases. I will say that in almost all cases, they certainly do assessments of reliability, and they keep their eye on it. But it's a different perspective when you're saying, well, we're the RTO, and our job is to make sure that the transmission system works adequately, make sure that in some cases that the power markets work adequately, but we don't have control, for example, over the power generation end of the market. And so again, we gave away a lot of control that I think probably would have been, we would not be struggling with things like, for example, climate policy. Climate policy would be easier probably to implement if all we had were vertically integrated utilities.
Well, okay, so let's just explore that for just a minute, because again, just to underscore this patchwork problem, right? That we have Okay, so we have less than 200 investor-owned utilities. They own the majority of the meters, right? They serve the biggest chunk of the market. But then you have the co-ops, and there are 800 of those, and you have 2,000 public power entities like Austin Energy here in town. So yes, you'd have some vertical integration. A lot of customers would be served by vertically integrated utilities, but a lot wouldn't be because of this patchwork, this regulatory framework that we have that is largely the legacy of the New Deal and getting rid of INSOL, right? The Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935. So I guess I'm adding all of that because I want to underscore the complexity. I guess the question is, how do we assure reliability now? Because everybody's talking about this, right? The PJM, other people saying, well, we don't have enough generation. How do we make sure that this most important network, right, our network of networks, our electric grid, is more reliable? Is there a way? Is there a role for Congress here? Is it going to have to be done at the state level? What is the? This is something that Texas has wrestled with here with the last legislative session. What? How do we make sure our electric grid is as strong as it can possibly be?
Well, and again, this is one of the things that we gave up as we moved to deregulated models, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's turn the clock back 30 years. If a utility commission, a well-run utility commission said, we're gonna need power in this region, they literally had the authority to order the utilities under its control to plan to build new power.
Uh-huh.
Now the incentives were such that didn't really have to happen very often. There were probably incentives more in the other way for utilities to overbuild, but there was that direct ability to say, yeah, we're gonna need more power, and you're gonna build it, and you're going to you're gonna get your money back through the compact that we have with ratepayers. In a state with deregulated markets, you can't snap your fingers. There is no legal fiat by where you can make somebody come in and build additional power.
Right.
So in the worst of circumstances, if you had unit retirements and growing load, and inadequate new supply, there's probably no remedy for it. I mean, you could attempt to offer regulatory incentives. You could argue that, well, we're going to be short for a while, and as we are short, prices are going to skyrocket, outages are going to continue, and developers will respond to that and come in and build new generation. But that's utterly chaotic, and not a good way to have the system you need. And I think that's the other thing about the previous sort of, I'm looking at them, as the good old days. There was at least a modicum of trying to get to the system you need. So you would have, you would build generation, and you would have adequate reserve, but you would try to avoid having lots and lots and lots of excess capacity,
Right.
which just adds cost to people. So you asked me, is there a federal solution? Not a federal solution that would pass Congress, because so much of the authority, there's authority vested in the states, for
Right.
example, that states are not going to want to give up.
Right.
And so I don't think there's a federal solution. And again, I'm struggling because I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to what the solution is.
Well, nor do I, but I wanted to just pose it to you because it's something that I think about a lot in terms of, what we saw here in ERCOT in Texas after the disaster. Well, whose fault is this? Well, nobody. Well, it's the market failed. Well, the buck doesn't stop anywhere, and to me that's a problem.
And again, Robert, this is you've pointed this out before, but one of the things that that I think people don't fully appreciate is that this is a class issue. And I'll tell you, I live in the great state of Wisconsin, the home of Generac, maker of large standalone generators, and I have a good job. I've been reasonably compensated, and if I wanted to buy a Generac generator to supply my house, that would be within my means to do. If we look at some of the outages that occurred in the West Coast in the past decade, California had a bunch of outages. There were some Pacific Northwest outages. Lots of wealthy people went out and bought standby generators.
Right.
Who doesn't buy standby generators? Who can't afford standby generators? Who suffers from from power failure, people who are less well off, the poor.
Right.
So again, this is one of the other things that I worry about is, are there forces in play that will be an unvirtuous spiral as people leave the grid? I mean, and this is one of the challenges. Take it back to Africa, right? Um, One of the challenges is to try to find ways to bring industrial customers that exist in Africa back to the grid,
Mm,
because many of those customers have, for reliability reasons, built self-generation.
right.
And so in my darker moments, I worry about whether we're setting ourselves on a pathway where something like that could actually happen in a place like America.
Well, aren't we already seeing that though, with some of the big tech companies effectively seceding from the grid, right? That we have them, owning their own generation. Oh, we'll be on the grid when we have to be on the grid, et cetera. Um, but let's shift there away from there for a minute, and because and again, a station break. My guest is Steve Brick. I haven't interrupted before because he's not selling anything. He doesn't have a book. He doesn't have a Twitter handle. He's not even on LinkedIn. There's nowhere I can send you to look him up. He has the first word and the last word in Juice: How Electricity Explains the World, our documentary. So you can find more about him there. He also is affiliated with the Clean Air Task Force. I don't think you mind me saying that, as well as Chicago. Let me see.
Council on Global Affairs.
Chicago Council on Global Affairs. But he is an independent power systems consultant with over 40 years of experience in the business. So what about models?
By the way, Robert, just to make it sound like I'm not a total Luddite, I do actually have an email address.
Well, you are talking to us on the computer, so that is a positive thing. And you do have a mailbox, so if people want to mail you something, I'm sure you can find it there. Um, let's talk about models. I'm longtime critical of these electric system modelers who say, "Oh, we can build all kinds of transmission, we can build all this capacity for renewables, and we can go to high penetration renewables, et cetera, et cetera." Let me ask the first question: what is a gigawatt mile?
A gigawatt mile is a construct that modelers have developed to imprecisely define how much new transmission will be required under different possible future scenarios. But it's a construct, and it's not a very good construct. It's a pretty weak construct.
Okay, because I made fun of this as there were models. The Department of Energy put out a model and said they need 47,300 gigawatt miles of new high voltage transmission. The New York Times dutifully parroted this line, and I called it phony baloney because I did a Google search and could not find it anywhere. So you are saying that some people do use this metric in the real world, which was news to me because after talking to other consultants and engineers, they'd never heard of it.
Yeah, well, again, so what do these models do? And again, so first of all, let's talk about models. And I want to channel the great statistician George Box, who said all models are wrong. Some of them are useful. So
Yeah.
so why do we use models to begin with, right? Um, I have a model of my retirement portfolio.
Hmm.
I have a model of my investments, and I use it to, to do what all people in my age category do. Will I have enough, to make it to my expected age of 127? And of course, the answer to that question is, well, it depends,
Right.
and it depends on certain key assumptions that I put on that model. That model, that model is highly accurate if you want me to tell you what my investment portfolio is going to be worth in a month.
Right.
If you want me to tell you what my investment portfolio is going to be worth in 20 years, that model is there's a lot of uncertainty, right?
Right.
And I use that example because I think a lot of people can kind of understand the financial analogy. The closer you are in time, the more secure you are with the kind of assumptions that you make, and you're probably going to be 90% right. Same is true for the electric grid. So we do all kinds of modeling in this business to do various things. So, for example, utilities will model for a particular region, and this could be an entire RTO, this could be a portion of an RTO. They run a model to sort of say this is what the utilization of power plants is expected to be for the next 24 hours.
Right.
So that kind of modeling gets done all the time, and that actually is done with a fairly high degree of accuracy. We also use models to kind of figure out, we're looking at our existing system, we're looking at our forecasted load over time, and we know that at some point in time, load is going to exceed the capacity of the existing generation resources that we have. And we use models to sort of analyze, well, what is the next power plant we should build? And that kind of modeling has been going on for a long time. And again, that is a model that it is dependent on the assumptions you put in. It is dependent upon whether or not the load growth that you forecasted actually happens, whether it's actually more or less. But we use it to run a bunch of scenarios, and we use it to say, well, of these 27 scenarios, 24 of them say that plant X is the kind of plant we want to build. So it literally is a single incremental new generation alternative. As climate has become a driving concern, suddenly the question has been converted to one of, how do we take the entire existing footprint of whatever it is we're modeling, and over time transition it from its present state, whatever that is, to a state that is lower carbon.
Right.
Okay. So think about that in the sense of, instead of sort of saying, well, what's the next power plant we're going to build? You're really asking, what are the next 500 power plants we're going to build?
Right.
And we're
and under a time constraint that would be different from what another or more traditional modeling would lay out, right? Instead of 5 years saying, oh, we're going to do this in 30 years or something to that effect. Is that true?
And again, that's the big issue, because instead of sort of saying, this is, typically if a utility back in the good old days, they'd say, well, we're seeing a need in the next 5 to 7 years to add some capacity, and here's the modeling that we're going to do, and we're going to present to the regulator to say, this is why we've concluded that a new coal plant or a new gas plant or something else is the best way to meet that load. Now we're typically focusing on timeframes like 2050.
Right.
And and again, these modelers are not evil people. They're all smart, I think, in their own ways. They're making the best set of assumptions in their judgment that we can, and they're putting them in very complicated models to yield scenarios that are somehow optimized for both cost and carbon. But over this incredibly long period of time, looking at an endpoint of 2050, when you know that from where we stand today, each one of those variables that goes into that model is going to be surrounded by a fairly high cloud of uncertainty relative to 2050. We're not very good at making really long-term precise projections. And again, all of that is just part of the honest effort to try to figure out, how do you decarbonize? But it's driven heavily by assumptions. And I think that there's either a conscious or an unconscious bias toward lowballing the costs for a lot of things, and even more critically, for ignoring factors outside of the model that are critically important in terms of the potential for success for any of these scenarios to come to materialization. So
if I was going to read that back to you, that would be quantifying the amount of land use that's needed, quantifying the resistance to encroachment, which is one of the, obviously, the issues I've been focused on. But Yeah, I think that's a fair discussion, and I don't want to spend too much more time on the models because I think you're right. I think that the time frames are, and I know we need to end here pretty soon. We've been talking for more than an hour. Let me just one more quick question on what's your take on nuclear right now? I've become more sober in my assessment of nuclear. I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. Are you hopeful now? Are you getting more hopeful or less hopeful? Give me your very quick assessment of the prospects for new nuclear in the United States, specifically in the next 5 years.
Well, I mean, the prospects are, a very large new nuclear power plant that has been under construction for a while and has come in, considerably over its original budget, is coming online and producing power in Georgia.
That's right. Unit 3 at Plant Vogtle.
Yeah, at Plant Vogtle. And so we have succeeded in building a new power plant. As a model for doing subsequent iterations, we need to get better, we need to get cheaper, we need to get faster. There are technologies that are moving along, particularly some of the small modular reactors that are I think more appropriately sized to the kinds of load growth that we're seeing. Right, so the Vogtle units, the AP1000s, it's 1,000 megawatt reactor, and so you add a unless you're a very large system, which Southern Company, Georgia Power, the builder of Vogtle is, that 1,000 megawatts is a lot to swallow in one lump, particularly if load is growing slowly. If you can add reactors in 250 megawatt increments, that is going to be better suited to the kinds of load growth that we're seeing in places like America and Europe.
Right.
Can we certainly have the potential to bring costs down. And so, for example, if we look at the projects that have been completed in the United Arab Emirates, a collaboration between Korean producer and Emiratis as the buyers of these plants. Those were produced for very reasonable cost per kilowatt relative to what we're doing here in the U.S. What's the difference? Well, they're not burdened with the same kind of regulatory situation that we are here,
Right.
and we're also not burdened with the kind of baked-in public resistance to nuclear power that we have in the United States.
Right.
So again, I think I am optimistic technically, and as somebody who I think from a precautionary standpoint, I'm absolutely persuaded that climate change is something that we need to be thinking about. I think nuclear power is an absolute must-have technology for addressing the problem in a cost-effective way. And by the way, that is not the position that I have held all my life. But as I 10 or 15 years ago, I started really thinking about what we needed both from a power standpoint, but also what we needed from an environmental standpoint. I kind of changed my tune on nuclear.
Yeah.
But again, there are a lot of hurdles out there. I don't think the big progress is necessarily going to be made in the U.S. and Europe, or at least Western Europe. I look to other places where I think if progress is going to be visible and quick, it's going to be there. Places like Eastern Europe, for example. Poland is expressing a lot of interest in developing nuclear. Right. Romania is expressing a lot of interest in new nuclear, and so again, a lot of challenges, but at least from a technical standpoint, I'm optimistic that a new generation of technology can come along that actually is cost effective and buildable in a reasonable amount of time.
Good. Last two questions. What are you reading?
What am I reading? You mean in all respects, or just in the energy world?
All respects.
All right. So
books we're after here.
Here we go. All right. I'm gonna tell you my newest discovery. The author of True Grit.
Aha.
Charles Pettis. I knew about True Grit. I got this book and came in a series of books that I own, and the plug was, this is the greatest American author that nobody has ever heard of, and his fiction, in my mind, is fall off the chair funny.
Okay.
in a dry and droll way, and it's not all westerns like True Grit. So that was a discovery. That's what I read on vacation.
Charles Pettus, Pettus.
You know what?
Oh,
I'm terrible.
okay. No
Just
problem.
people should remember, look up the author of True Grit, and it's that guy.
Okay, got it. No problem.
Okay. And then again, I read um all I haven't the last really great energy book that I read was the one that I plugged on the last time I was on your show, which is Meredith Angwin's book, Shorting the Grid.
Uh-huh.
And generally speaking, and then I read your book, of course, but I don't need to plug your book for you. I generally I'm pretty disappointed by books, and but I tend to read some of the more decent reporting. Economist just had I thought a pretty good extended piece on transmission and the challenges of building transmission. I often look to them for some sort of more soberer kind of energy reporting. But again, there's in the energy world, there's a lot of not very deep stuff out there, as you well know, Robert.
I do. It's Charles Portis,
Portis.
Portis.
Portis, thank you.
Charles Portis, Portis.
You can Google and you can do two things at the same time. Yeah, Charles Portis. Check him out. He's quite funny.
No problem. And lastly, and then I'll let you after this one. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? So I spent a lot of time, as you indicated, working for Clean Air Task Force, which is a rather unusual NGO, focused on developing low carbon technologies, but absolutely technologically agnostic. The belief is we need as many of them as we possibly have. They need to be cost effective. They need to be widely deployable. And we have got a crop of 20 to 30-year-old. Many of them are PhDs. Many of them are masters. And they're committed, and they're interested, and they're open-minded, and they're hardworking, and they see the complexity of the climate problem, and they're putting their shoulder to the wheel and in an open-minded way to try to come up with real workable solutions that are fit to purpose, not just for America or Europe, but that are fit to purpose for the globe. And that gives me hope.
Well, that's a good place to stop then. My guest has been Steve Brick. He is an independent power systems consultant. You don't have to look him up because you won't find him. But he is my good friend, and glad to have you back on for the second time on the Power Hungry podcast. Steve, it's been great to catch up, and glad to get your latest insights on what's happening in Africa and elsewhere.
Great. My pleasure, Robert. Always good to talk.
And thanks to all of you in podcast land. Tune in to the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. And before you do that, if you haven't done it already, subscribe to my to my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, and give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever reviewing platform you're on. And until the next time, we will see you right back here on the Power Hungry podcast. See ya.